SN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Big case just came down in the U.S. Supreme Court and might not seem important to you at first, but it really is. It's a free speech case parading as a political contribution case, talking about Mccutchen versus the FEC. We've got Steve Simpson. He's Director of Legal Studies at the Ayn Rand Institute. He writes and speaks and gives interviews on constitutional law, freedom of speech, campaign finance law, and many other legal topics. Steve, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So this case is a big case in its own right, but it's a continuation of a line of cases kind of really diminishing the power and eliminating the limits on campaign contributions and thereby free speech in campaigns.
Yep, that's right. So basically the big case that most people have heard of is the Citizens United case, which came down in 2010. And in that case, the Supreme Court struck down a law that outright prohibited corporations from spending money on their own political ads. And in the case, actually, it involved a small nonprofit called Citizens United. And they wanted to make a film criticizing Hillary Clinton when she was running for president, and the laws actually prevented them from doing that. So they challenged it, and the Supreme Court saw the really egregious restriction on free speech that these laws represented. So they struck the law down, and since that time they've issued a couple other decisions that have continued in that same direction, which is basically protecting the right to free speech, the individual right to free speech, which covers not only your right to, speak as we're doing now, but to finance whatever it takes to finance your speech, whether that comes in the form of books, let's say, or newspapers, or in the case of Citizens United, a film, or let's say a radio show. I mean, bottom line is the Supreme Court has recognized is that it costs money to speak, and if you restrict the money, you end up restricting the speech, and that's where Mccutchen comes in.
And basically, this line of speeches has got the liberals, the progressives, really in an uproar, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, it does for a couple of reasons. I mean, the ostensive reason is that they think money has too big an influence on politics, which in my view is complete nonsense, and in any event is the wrong way to look at it. You might as well, if you're going to complain that money has too big an influence on politics while you're at it, you might as well complain that the New York Times has too big an influence on politics, or the Wall Street Journal, or any other newspaper or television show. The fact of the matter is all money gets you is the ability to speak to people. Nobody is buying votes or buying elections, as we constantly hear. What they're doing is they're buying the ability to speak out to people. And if we take the right to free speech seriously as an actual right, meaning you're entitled to do it regardless of what other people think or how loudly or how much you do it, then we need to protect people's rights to speak as much as they want, as long as they want, and as loudly as they want, so long as they're not violating the rights of other people. So the progressives, though, they take what I would call an egalitarian view of the First Amendment, which is essentially everybody should speak equally and only to the extent that everybody else is speaking. And as a result, we can level things down to the lowest common denominator. So what's the impact of that, of course? That means that the people who are speaking the loudest or most articulately are the ones that have to be silenced. And that's a very different conception of freedom of speech than the founders intended, and it's certainly a different conception of free speech than one would get from an individual right. It essentially collectivizes the idea of free speech.
So Mccutchen basically does away with the limits of aggregate contribution limits to campaigns, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So most people know that there are limits on individual contributions to individual candidates, and those are right around $2,500. But fewer people know that there's also a total limit on the total amount you can spend on all candidates. So the way this works is it says that you can give up to the individual limit for a certain number of candidates But if you cross a threshold, and that threshold is for all candidates and campaigns is $123,000. If you go beyond that, let's say you want to support a lot of candidates or political campaigns, you're capped. And the way Justice Roberts, for his majority opinion, the way he put it is, that would be tantamount to telling a newspaper that they can only endorse, let's say, 9 candidates, but they can't endorse the 10th. That's an outright restriction on the number of people they can support, and it's a clear violation of the First Amendment. So Mccutchen struck that limit down under, in my view, the appropriate view of the First Amendment, which is that, you know, if you have the right to speak, you have the right to support candidates, and you can support as many as you want. And that's a very good development, because for about 3 decades in this country, we were heading in the wrong direction, and campaign finance laws culminated in the McCain-Feingold law in the early 2000s, which actually said that you can't, that certain people and entities can't even mention a candidate before an election without violating the law, which should be considered completely outrageous.
That was an insane law. And that one is basically gone now as well, isn't it?
Yeah, for the most part, that law is gone. That's what Citizens United struck down. And since that time, the court has issued a couple other decisions, and Mccutchen is right in line with that. So they're on the march, I think, toward freeing up more speech and more ability for people to join together and to influence voters and elections, which is exactly what the First Amendment supports.
Now, what do you say to people who say there's too much money in politics, all campaigns should be publicly financed, and that'll solve all the problems? Is that a realistic solution?
No, it's not a realistic solution. In fact, I would challenge the underlying premise, but let me get to that in a minute and talk a little bit about public financing. So what happens when you put the government in charge of the purse strings? The answer is that the government, if the government pays the piper, the government calls the tune. And of course, along with public financing come all kinds of strings attached to what you can say and the extent to which you can say it. You have to go back and apply to the government for additional funds. So basically that's putting the government in charge of one's ability to pay for speech, which ultimately means putting it in charge of the ability to speak, which is a horrible idea and can only lead to censorship and concentration of power in a few government officials. It also, by the way, which is something that people typically ignore, it's a gross violation on your rights as a taxpayer to have to finance somebody else's speech. I don't want to finance the speech of politicians. I may disagree with them. If I'm going to fund a politician, I want to fund the politicians that I actually agree with. So I shouldn't be forced to finance politicians because some people think that there's something wrong with money in elections. And there's nothing wrong with money in elections per se. If we want to complain about something, we should complain about the power of government. The reason that people want to influence government is that government influences them. I mean, think about your average businessman. The government can spell the difference between existence and non-existence, between business life and business death. Taxpayers, same thing. Private property owners. I mean, people are regulated to the hilt by government these days, so they have a big incentive to protect themselves from what government can do. And the way you do that is by trying to influence voters and politicians. Essentially, we've created government like a big kind of protection racket. So it shouldn't surprise us that people want to influence what government does. If people are unhappy about that, the only solution is to limit government's power, strictly limit it to protecting rights, so that people don't have an incentive and the government doesn't have the ability to screw around with people's lives.
So really, the problem that people are seeking to address, that it's really a misdiagnosis here. It's not that there's too much money in politics per se. It's that the system has too much power over you and I, and that they're exerting too much power over the economic system, and therefore effectively the system's become an auction, and the price of the goods or the services to be delivered is for sale, and you have to get in on the bidding, and that's where it all comes in.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good way to put it. The way I often put it is the problem is not that there's too much money in politics. The problem is that politics controls too much money. In fact, politics shouldn't control money or private behavior or economics at all. We should have a total separation of state and economics. There's a really more fundamental problem too, which is in the way we think of government. We don't have a clear idea of what government should do, and not knowing what government should do leads us to not knowing what government should not do. So the whole idea of corrupting government makes no sense if you don't have a clear idea of what government should do in the first place. Because think about what corruption means. It means deviating from the ideal or the proper purpose. So we don't even know what government's proper purpose is. We have to restrict it, or we should restrict it, to protecting people's rights, which ultimately means preventing some people from preying on others by using force against them. That's a clear objective principle. If you're not going to do that, then think about even I'm sometimes sympathetic to the average legislator because they get competing claims all the time. One group say the elderly wants them to sacrifice the incomes of the young for the sake of the old, or another politician wants to sacrifice the incomes of the middle class for the sake of everybody. Some other politician wants to sacrifice one business for the good of another business. How are they supposed to sort all these claims out? The answer that we have in today's world is majority rule. So we just vote on these things, and whoever the majority wants to pillage, the majority pillages. It's hard to blame the average politician for not knowing what direction is up or what he should do. So when he has some interest group come to him and say, look, we're going to fund your campaign if you'll gore the other guy's ox rather than ours, why should the guy say no? It makes sense for him to say yes. But if we have a clear principle, which is that government is supposed to protect us in essence from criminals, it's supposed to prevent people from violating our rights, then that's an objective principle. A government can say, an official can say, sorry, my job is to protect rights. It's not to give people handouts. It's not to distribute harm and benefits to some people. So there's nothing I can do about that. Go solve your problem yourself, and that would do away with pretty much all, if not or most, if not all, of the government corruption that we have these days. And it would reduce the incentive for people to try to game the system.
Imagine that. Well, we'll talk more about that up next on the Financial Survival Network.
FSN Radio.
Do you have Medicare or health insurance through your employer? If so, listen up. The healthcare reform wasn't written to save the healthcare industry or even to lower healthcare costs. Shoot, it isn't even designed to insure the uninsured. It's just a temporary political byproduct. Like a flat rock you step on in a swiftly moving stream, Obamacare is just a means to an end. Want to learn more about Obama's ultimate objective? Then you'll want to review our latest research presentation found on oclies.com. In it, a health expert and industry insider explains what you think you know about caring for your health is about to drastically change in 2014. Plus, he details the simple steps you could take to save thousands of dollars per year in health costs. It's free for you to preview at oclies.com. Don't waste time. What you don't know about the healthcare reform could hurt you and your family.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
And we are back on the Financial Survival Network. We're talking with Steve Simpson of the Ayn Rand Institute. Imagine that, a legislator telling you, go solve your own problem yourself. How's he ever going to get reelected, Steve?
Well, if we limited the power of government, then there wouldn't be anybody competing on the other side saying, hey, I'll give you all these handouts. And think about that for a minute. Every election season, what is it that these guys trade on? They invite people to come to the state capitals or Washington, D.C., and vote for them. Why? Because they have the most goodies to hand out. So we are competing. Basically, what politics has become these days is a vast competition for other people's money, other people's time, and other people's resources. which really should strike people as sickening. And, it shouldn't surprise us that politicians clamor to get elected by handing people more and more money. I mean, they sit atop this vast, pile of wealth. It's other people's money, and they're auctioning it off. Of course, that should strike us as grotesque and sickening. And in a very real sense, we should look at it as corrupt. But the corruption is what government can control. It's not fundamentally in what people ask it to do. If you allow government to control your life, people are going to try to control government. So that's just the process that we've created.
Yeah, and you're so right. The idea that government is there to solve every problem that comes along. Whatever happened to individuality towards living your own life and only resorting to government as a last resort? That's what it was there for when there were problems that had to be solved and that couldn't be solved any other way. Then you resorted to government. It seems to be the exact opposite of that now, doesn't it, Steve?
Yeah, that's definitely true, and it's because we've allowed other ideas, and the way you put it, I think, is good. Individuality. This nation was first founded on the idea of individualism, which means that you're free to pursue your own happiness and your own life, and other people have absolutely no right to use force to prevent you from doing so or to force you to support them. That's the ideal of American freedom, but we've corrupted that ideal with what I would call collectivism. I think is a good way to put it, which is the idea that we are all our brother's keeper, and that the government has to kind of be the keeper in chief and force us to follow what ultimately is a collectivist morality. It's the idea that I exist to serve other people rather than to live my own life. So the way I would put it is that it's not just that government is supposed to be a last resort. It's that government has a particular purpose, and that purpose is protecting us, not distributing our money to others or forcing us to live for the sake of other people or to devote our lives to other people or to support them. If we want to support them, that's our choice. It's not the choice of the government. And that's the fundamental issue. Once you start down that road, there are just an endless number of, mouths to feed or claims on your time and your life, not just, feeding the poor, but heck, anybody who comes calling. Now, these days we're talking about forgiving student loans. I mean, where the hell do people get off claiming that my obligation is to support some college student who can't get a job now? I want to support my own kids. I don't want to support your kids. So, the ultimate problem here is that we have the wrong view of what the government is supposed to do, and we've come to look at everybody as kind of a victim waiting to have their lives led and supported by other people.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a course in college now called victimology. If you're not a victim or you don't think you're a victim, come take this course and we'll prove to you that you're a victim. So then you can seek redress in the halls of Congress and get money and programs and support for your victimhood, because everybody's a victim to some extent, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and that's built right into the concept that I talked about before, which is that morally we're all our brother's keeper, because the whole idea is some of us are able to govern our own lives and some of us aren't. They're the victims, and it's your obligation to care for all of them. Well, once you start and you set that premise in motion, of course there becomes an incentive for everybody to become a victim so they can be the beneficiary of all of that, government largesse. And that's exactly the opposite approach that we ought to take. We ought to be encouraging people to care for themselves, but you can't do that if you really believe that we have a moral obligation to care for others. That's a victim mentality. And it's contrary to what I would call human nature. It's contrary to the way people actually are. They're not, nobody is a natural victim. We're all and should consider ourselves to be naturally independent and able to care for ourselves and choose to deal with others rather than be forced to deal with others.
Well, I think the problem with everyone being a victim is eventually there's nobody left to pay for your victimhood, and then what happens? The system kind of collapses, and I think that's the moment that we're heading towards, where okay, you're a victim. Well, who's going to pay for your victimhood? We're running out of resources for it, and that's where the problem's going to really happen when that day arises.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And I think if you want to circle it back to campaign finance law, part of what you see today is a lot of people, businesses and others, really clamoring to try to influence this system, and those who are in favor of the system taking control of more and more of your life and more of your income, until we get to a point where we have a small percentage of people trying to or being forced essentially to care for the vast majority of people. Well, ask yourself, what are those small percentage of people going to do? I say they're going to rebel and they're going to try to affect the system, but of course that's what the architects of the system want to prevent, and the way to prevent them from doing that is to prevent them from spending money to speak out and try to influence politicians and voters, which is exactly why we need, if we care about the direction of this country, we need to, among many other things, oppose campaign finance laws so people can speak and influence the system and try to save it.
And one thing we are all victims of is this collectivist monster that's been created that's really devouring the country and taking things over.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the way to fight back is to challenge the ideas and the policies that support it. And again, that gets me back to, if we want to save this country and put it on the right track, we need to preserve the right to freedom of speech. If we don't have freedom of speech, then it's impossible to convince people to do the right thing. It's impossible to bring light to the problems in this country, and the negative direction will just continue. So free speech is absolutely essential. Campaign finance law can seem boring and kind of arcane at times, but it's a really important issue that I'm glad to see the Supreme Court doing the right thing. But I'd love to see more people in the public understanding these laws and challenging them, because it's really in their interest to do so.
For certain. So, Steve, just let us know where we find you and your writing.
You can find me at the Ayn Rand Institute's website, which is www.aynrand.org, O-R-G. And we just revamped the website, so tons of great information, both about Ayn Rand's ideas and about the folks at ARI. So please come visit.
Yep, I'm looking at it right now. It looks real nice and clean. Link to the site can be found in the show notes to this interview on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Don't forget to sign up to our newsletter. Steve, thanks so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks a lot.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.